Dad, can we go Starbucks after this?
Expectation is not always spoken aloud. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, disguised as confidence, carried in posture rather than words. Today, it arrived with certainty, the certainty that this courtroom would adjust itself to you. I recognized that certainty the moment these proceedings began. It was present before any argument was made, before any fact was discussed, before the weight of consequence was even acknowledged. You did not enter this courtroom preparing for judgment. You entered expecting negotiation. That expectation was misplaced. This court does not exist to confirm personal belief. It exists to apply law. When those two collide, belief must yield. That is not cruelty. That is structure. You appeared surprised, not by the charge itself, but by the seriousness with which it was treated. That reaction revealed more than any testimony could. People who understand accountability do not appear shocked by consequence. They prepare for it. They anticipate it. They accept that outcome may be uncomfortable. You did none of those things. Instead, you approach this process as though explanation would substitute for responsibility, as though background would soften breach, as though confidence would translate into consideration beyond what statute allows. This court has seen that approach before. It does not end well. The law provides discretion, not accommodation. It allows judgment, not favoritism. When discretion is confused with indulgence, justice begins to fracture. From the beginning, your focus was not on what occurred, but on how it would affect you. Your language centered on impact to your life, your plans, your stability. Rarely did it center on the harm caused, the rule violated, or the boundary crossed. That imbalance matters. Accountability begins where self interest ends. This court does not doubt that you believed your situation was unique. Most people who expect special treatment do. They believe difference equals exception. It does not. Difference demands the same law be applied without distortion. You were afforded every procedural protection the law guarantees. You were heard. You were represented. You were considered. What you were not given was assurance that outcome would align with expectation. That assurance does not exist here. This case is not complex. It is uncomfortable. Those are not the same thing. The violation was clear. The statute is clear. The precedent is clear. What complicates this case is not ambiguity in law, but resistance to its application. Resistance does not change outcome, it clarifies necessity. You expected leniency because you expected understanding. This court understood you fully. That understanding did not produce the result you anticipated, and that is where expectation finally met reality. Entitlement rarely announces itself with arrogance. More often, it arrives wrapped in reason. It presents itself as explanation, as context, as a request for understanding that quietly assumes accommodation will follow. That is how it appeared here. From the outset, you framed your conduct as an aberration rather than a breach. You emphasized stress, circumstance, and intent as though the absence of malice could erase the presence of violation. This court does not confuse motive with permission. Motive may explain why something occurred. It does not determine whether it was allowed. You spoke at length about pressure, about expectations placed upon you by others, about moments where judgment was clouded and decisions were rushed. None of that was ignored, but none of it displaced responsibility. Pressure does not suspend law. It reveals how one behaves when law matters most. What concerned this court was not that you sought understanding, it was that you expected it to absolve. You spoke as though explanation was currency to be exchanged for leniency, as though sincerity could substitute for accountability. That assumption misunderstands the purpose of this forum. A courtroom is not a space where comfort is negotiated. It is a place where boundaries are clarified. You appeared unsettled when procedure did not bend to narrative, when timelines mattered, when facts were addressed without embellishment, when questions returned repeatedly to what was done, rather than why you wished it had not been addressed so severely. That discomfort was telling. Those who accept responsibility focus on conduct. Those who expect special treatment focus on consequence. This court observed how frequently the discussion returned to your future, to what you might lose, to how the sentence might affect your standing, your plans, your sense of stability. Rarely did it remain on the certainty that the law was violated and that harm resulted from that violation. Justice does not measure fairness by how gently it lands on the offender. It measures fairness by how consistently it is applied. You were not surprised by the law. You were surprised by its firmness. That distinction matters. The law did not change between the moment you acted and the moment you stood here. What changed was your proximity to consequence. This court is not persuaded by proximity, it is guided by principle. There were opportunities throughout these proceedings for full acceptance, opportunities to acknowledge that expectation played no role in outcome, that responsibility does not arrive with conditions. Those opportunities were met instead with resistance, subtle, polite, persistent resistance to the idea that consequence would be complete, that resistance narrowed the court's options. Leniency requires acknowledgement, accountability requires acceptance. What this court received was justification. Justification does not invite mercy, it demands correction. You expected flexibility. What the law required was clarity, and clarity, once required, does not compromise. Equality before the law is often spoken of as an ideal. In practice, it is experienced as a shock by those who have never encountered it without cushioning. Neutrality feels harsh only when one expects adjustment. It feels unforgiving only when one is accustomed to accommodation. This court does not operate on instinct or impulse, it operates on precedent. Precedent is not memory, it is discipline. It is the accumulated refusal of courts before this one to allow expectation to influence outcome. When precedent is abandoned for convenience, justice becomes selective. Selectivity is the beginning of distrust. You were measured against the same standards applied to individuals who entered this courtroom without confidence, without leverage, without belief that the system would soften for them. Those individuals do not ask what they are owed. They ask what the law requires. That difference matters more than tone or presentation. This court reviewed prior cases with similar violations, similar impact, similar statutory thresholds. In each instance, consequence followed not because the offender was unsympathetic, but because the conduct demanded it. Consistency is not coldness, it is fairness in its most demanding form. You expected your case to be viewed as exceptional. You believe circumstances elevated your narrative above precedent. That belief misunderstands the purpose of precedent entirely. Precedent exists precisely to prevent personal narrative from distorting outcome. If this court were to carve out leniency here, it would not be doing you a favor. It would be teaching the wrong lesson to every future litigant that confidence influences consequence, that expectation can bend law, that neutrality is optional. This court will not teach that lesson. The harshness you now perceive is not generated by the sentence itself. It is generated by the removal of expectation. When expectation is stripped away, what remains is law in its unaltered form. That form feels severe only because it is unfamiliar to those who rarely encounter it. You did not encounter cruelty here, you encountered consistency. The public often misunderstands severity. They associate it with emotion, with excess, with punishment imposed for its own sake. In reality, severity is often the result of restraint exercised too long, boundaries enforced too late, and clarity delayed until it becomes unavoidable. This court is tasked not with pleasing the present moment, but with protecting the future integrity of the system. That responsibility outweighs discomfort. It outweighs perception. It outweighs expectation. Your disappointment does not render the outcome unjust. It renders it clear. And clarity, once required, does not retreat. Responsibility is not a feeling. It is not regret, discomfort, or surprise. It is recognition. Recognition that one's actions crossed a line that existed long before personal circumstance entered the picture. This court waited for that recognition. It did not arrive. You spoke often of intent. You emphasized that harm was not your goal, that you did not anticipate the outcome, that the situation unfolded faster than expected. Intent matters in many contexts. Here it mattered less than you believed it should. The law does not require foresight of every consequence. It requires adherence to boundaries. When those boundaries are crossed, responsibility does not ask whether harm was planned. It asks whether harm occurred as a result of choice. This court is also mindful of what leniency communicates. Leniency is not a private gesture, it is a public signal. It tells future defendants how this system responds to expectation. It tells future victims whether fairness depends on confidence. It tells the public whether accountability is consistent or conditional. In this case, leniency would have sent the wrong signal. It would have suggested that consequence can be softened by demeanor, that explanation can outweigh violation, that expectation has leverage. That suggestion erodes trust faster than any single sentence ever could. Public trust does not collapse loudly. It erodes quietly, case by case, exception by exception. Courts rarely see the damage immediately. They see it years later when confidence is gone and cynicism has replaced belief. This court will not contribute to that erosion. You were not judged harshly. You were judged plainly. The sentence imposed reflects the seriousness of the conduct and the necessity of reaffirming boundaries that cannot be negotiated away. It reflects the understanding that restraint shown too often becomes permission. There were moments in these proceedings when acceptance could have altered tone, when full acknowledgement could have narrowed outcome. Those moments passed not because the court was unwilling, but because responsibility remained conditional in your presentation. Conditional responsibility is not responsibility, it is calculation. The law does not reward calculation, it corrects it. You may believe the sentence ignores who you are. It does not. It simply refuses to prioritize who you are over what was done. That refusal is the essence of equality before the law. This court understands that firmness can feel final. It can feel unforgiving. But forgiveness is not the court's mandate. Fairness is, and fairness, when applied without distortion, often feels heavier than expected. That weight is not punishment. It is alignment. Severity, when it appears in a courtroom, is often mischaracterized as excess. It is described as a failure of compassion, a rigidity of perspective, a refusal to consider humanity. Those descriptions misunderstand what severity actually is. Severity is not the absence of mercy. It is the presence of responsibility applied without distortion. This court did not arrive at the sentence imposed impulsively. It arrived there because every lesser response failed the test of integrity. Integrity requires that outcomes align not with expectation, but with law. When those two diverge, the court must choose the latter, regardless of discomfort. You expected mitigation. You expected the court to carve out space between statute and consequence where your circumstances could reside. That space exists only when responsibility is fully accepted. What this court observed instead was a continuous effort to narrow culpability while broadening sympathy. That imbalance left no room for mitigation. Legacy is often invoked at moments like this, not explicitly but implicitly. The idea that this decision will define you, that the sentence will overshadow everything else, that the weight of consequence will follow longer than the act itself. Those concerns are real. They are also inevitable. What defines a legacy is not how firmly one resists accountability, but how one responds when it arrives. This court did not see response. It saw resistance, polite resistance, articulate resistance, persistent resistance to the idea that the law would conclude without accommodation. The hardest sentence is rarely imposed to shock. It is imposed when clarity must be unmistakable, when ambiguity would invite repetition, when the system must draw a line visible enough to be recognized by those watching closely. This is such a moment. The severity of this sentence is proportional not only to the violation, but to the expectation surrounding it. Expectation magnifies consequence because it reveals the distance between belief and reality. When that distance is great, correction must be equally firm. Some will argue that harshness discourages trust, that it alienates rather than reassures. This court rejects that argument. Trust is not built on comfort. It is built on predictability, on the knowledge that outcomes are not tailored to confidence, persuasion, or narrative. You were not denied empathy, you were denied exception. That distinction is critical. The law does not function as a mirror, reflecting back what one hopes to see. It functions as a boundary, revealing where one stands when expectation falls away. Today, that boundary was enforced fully. The sentence imposed is not an act of severity, it is an act of preservation, preservation of standard, preservation of precedent, preservation of a system that cannot survive if it begins choosing which expectations to honor. This court is aware that time will soften perception, that years from now, this case may be reduced to a headline, a summary, a statistic. What will remain is not the shock of the sentence, but the stability of the rule it reaffirmed. Rules endure longer than reactions. You leave this courtroom changed by this decision. The system leaves reinforced by it. That balance is not accidental, it is intentional. The law did not meet your expectation today, it corrected it. There is a tendency, when a sentence is described as hard, to assume it was delivered with certainty alone. That assumption is incomplete. Certainty was present, but so was deliberation. What this court accepts, and has always accepted, is that firmness invites misunderstanding. It invites criticism. It invites the accusation that compassion was absent. This court accepts that cost willingly. The law is not validated by immediate approval, it is validated by endurance. You may believe this decision defines a single moment. In truth, it defines a trajectory. Consequence is not confined to the day it is imposed. It unfolds over time, reshaping perspective, altering assumptions, stripping away beliefs that once felt immovable. That process is neither quick nor comfortable. It is, however, corrective. This court is often asked whether severity teaches anything beyond fear. It does when it is applied correctly. It teaches boundaries. It teaches permanence. It teaches that expectations, once disproven, do not quietly return. They are replaced by awareness. Awareness is what this court hopes will emerge from this decision, not compliance born of intimidation, but understanding forged through consequence. That understanding cannot be negotiated into existence, it must be experienced. You may reflect on this sentence as disproportionate. Many do at first. Over time, reflection often reframes severity as inevitability. That reframing does not require agreement, it requires distance. Distance reveals patterns that proximity obscures. This court has seen countless individuals stand where you stand now, convinced their case was different, convinced their expectation was reasonable, convinced consequence would soften at the edge. In time, most recognized that what felt harsh was simply unfiltered law. Unfiltered law feels unforgiving only to those who rarely encounter it. The system cannot function if it constantly dilutes itself to preserve comfort. Comfort is not its mandate, fairness is. Fairness demands that outcome not fluctuate based on confidence, articulation, or insistence. This court understands that its decision will be discussed, criticized, and dissected. That scrutiny is welcome. Decisions that cannot withstand scrutiny should not be made. This one will. It will withstand scrutiny because it does not rely on interpretation, emotion, or symbolism. It relies on alignment, alignment between conduct and consequence, between statute and sentence, between principle and practice. The hardest sentence is not imposed lightly. It is imposed when every softer alternative threatens the integrity of the line the law must hold. Today, that line was held without hesitation. This court does not expect gratitude for that. It does not seek validation. It seeks continuity. Continuity of standard, of expectation, of rule. You expected accommodation. What you received was correction. Correction is rarely gentle. It is rarely welcomed. It is, however, necessary. Finality is often mistaken for cruelty. In reality, finality is clarity. It marks the point where uncertainty ends and consequence begins. This court does not fear finality because uncertainty is what allows expectation to linger and entitlement to survive. You may believe the sentence closes doors permanently. In one sense, it does. It closes the door on the belief that accountability can be postponed, reshaped, or negotiated. That door must close for anything meaningful to take its place. Legacy is not something this court assigns, it is something shaped by response. How one carries consequence matters more than how one argues against it. Resistance defines a moment, acceptance defines a future. This court is aware that its role places it at odds with personal narratives. That tension is unavoidable. The justice system cannot prioritize individual expectation without sacrificing collective trust. When forced to choose, trust must prevail. Trust is not built through reassurance, it is built through predictability. When people know that outcomes do not bend to pressure, confidence in the system grows, even if individual outcomes feel severe. That confidence is fragile. It depends on decisions like this one being made consistently. You expected to be treated differently. That expectation did not arise in isolation. It was shaped by a world that often rewards insistence, persistence, and confidence. Courts cannot mirror that world. They must correct it. This court understands that years from now, this sentence may still be remembered as harsh. That is acceptable. What would be unacceptable is for it to be remembered as inconsistent. Consistency is the quiet backbone of justice. Without it, fairness collapses into perception. There are moments when the law must choose between being liked and being reliable. This court chose reliability. The hardest sentences are rarely about the individual alone. They are about the system declaring what it will not tolerate, not loudly, not emotionally, definitively. You leave this courtroom with certainty now, certainty that expectation does not alter outcome, that confidence does not dilute consequence, that neutrality is not optional. That certainty is uncomfortable. It is also instructive. This court accepts being misunderstood in the present to preserve clarity in the future. That is the burden of authority exercised correctly. The law does not exist to soften disappointment. It exists to correct assumption. That correction has now been made. Time is often the final arbiter of decisions that feel heavy in the moment. This court does not expect immediate agreement with its judgment. It expects understanding to develop gradually, shaped by distance rather than emotion. That is how accountability settles into perspective. You will have time now, time to reflect without negotiation, without explanation, without expectation that outcome will change. Time has a way of clarifying what argument cannot. It strips away justification and leaves only sequence, action, consequence, response. This court has not acted to make an example of you. Examples are loud and performative. What this court has done is quieter. It has restored alignment, alignment between rule and response, between conduct and consequence, between expectation and reality. The sentence imposed does not seek to define you forever. It defines this moment. What follows is shaped by how you carry it. The law does not determine who you become next. It determines what it will tolerate now. There is no satisfaction in firmness. There is responsibility. Responsibility to those who follow, to those who watch, and to those who depend on consistency they may never see directly but always feel. That responsibility outweighs personal discomfort every time. This court recognizes that harshness is a word often used when neutrality feels unfamiliar. In time, neutrality reveals itself not as cruelty, but as stability. Stability is what allows systems to endure long after individual cases are forgotten. Nothing about this decision was rushed. Nothing about it was personal. It was shaped by statute, guided by precedent, and completed by necessity. That is the only way justice can function without becoming selective. You expected accommodation. You received correction. That correction was firm because it needed to be. It was final because it had to be. The law does not promise comfort. It promises consistency. That promise has been kept. Court is adjourned.